User under the nickname Screamclay. I first experienced sleep paralysis when I was still in school. I didn't know what it was then and thought I was dying. I woke up in the middle of the night, saw the moonlight coming through the window, and wanted to turn over, but I realized I couldn't even move a finger. My body felt like it was chained to the bed, and my breathing became heavy and ragged. I felt like I was suffocating. But the worst thing happened when I felt someone's presence nearby. It seemed to me that someone was standing at the head of the bed, but I could not turn my head. Then I heard the sound of footsteps, as if someone was slowly moving across the floor, watching me. It felt like someone was looking at me, and the most terrible thoughts came into my head. I imagined that it could be a ghost or an evil spirit. At that moment, I experienced wild horror. It seemed that I was plunged into my own nightmare in reality. Then I felt a slight pressure on my chest, as if someone invisible was sitting on my ribs. I wanted to call for help, but I could not squeeze out a sound. Probably lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Suddenly I could move my arm, then my whole body jerked and rolled back against the wall. I gasped for air as if I had experienced something impossible. My room was empty, and only the moon continued to shine on the floor. I cried with relief. I couldn't sleep all night after that, afraid that if I closed my eyes again, I would find myself in the same state. I have experienced sleep paralysis several more times. Sometimes I managed to react. As soon as I felt my body begin to turn to stone, I tried to move my fingers or concentrate on my breathing. This helped, but there were times when I fell into the same horror again. Once, it seemed to me that a shadow with a distorted face appeared on the wall and reached out to me with its hands. I could not scream and could not defend myself. There was a moment when I doubted that I was alive at all. When I finally learned that this phenomenon is called sleep paralysis, I felt better. I realized that I was not going crazy and that I was not being haunted by otherworldly forces. However, the feeling of creepiness remained, because even with the understanding of the nature of this condition, it did not become less scary. Even now, if I feel that I am falling into paralysis, I try to remain calm, control my breathing, move my fingers or toes to restore mobility to the whole body. Sometimes it works, but sometimes I again hear footsteps and feel touches that are not really there. Someone said that you can overcome sleep paralysis if you completely relax and don't resist, but I can't do it. As soon as I realize that I can't move, panic overwhelms me, and I start frantically trying to break out of this state. The visions only become more frightening. Faces, whispers, footsteps, touches. Everything seems too real. Sometimes I get the impression that paralysis is a window into another world, where my own fears live, taking on a physical form. The worst thing about my experiences is that I always hope that everything will pass quickly, but time seems to stretch out. Sometimes it seems to me that I can lie like this for minutes, although most likely it does not last long. Recently, I had a situation when I saw a figure of a woman in an old-fashioned dress in the room. She seemed to be moving as if she wanted to come closer to me. I heard a quiet hissing, as if she was trying to say something. I wanted to close my eyes, but my eyelids did not obey either. When I managed to move my hand, the figure seemed to melt into the semi-darkness, and I jumped up in bed and turned on the light. I felt my heart beating wildly. Then I sat for a long time, hugging my knees and tried to calm down. Over time, I learned to tell myself that it was all just a mind game, that there was no evil spirit in the room. But it was still terrifying. I would have preferred to never know about this phenomenon, but since it has become a part of my life, I try to hedge my bets. I sleep in a position that seems safer to me. I try not to overexert myself, because stress and fatigue always provoke sleep paralysis. And yet, from time to time, I find myself in this eerie space where you are completely helpless. I think those who have experienced something like this understand what I am talking about. User under the nickname Night Deer. My sleep paralysis started after I had been sleep deprived for a long time. I was studying for exams, working part-time, not really getting any proper rest, drinking a lot of coffee. Finally, one night, I woke up and realized that I couldn't move. My body felt heavy as concrete. I panicked, tried to breathe, but it felt like someone had covered my mouth and nose with their hand. At first I thought it was a real danger, maybe someone had gotten into the house. It was dark. I couldn't look around, All I could do was listen. And then I heard something rustling on the floor, like someone in long clothes was moving very close. I tried to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I was overcome with a chilling horror. I felt someone's invisible presence literally hanging over me. Then this something moved and stood next to my bed. I felt like I was about to be attacked. I could hear my own pulse and there was a ringing in my ears. Finally, when I could open my mouth slightly, I tried to take short breaths and immediately felt that I could gradually move. First the muscles in my face trembled, then my hands. I sat up abruptly and took a convulsive breath. The room was dark, quiet. Nothing was happening. Everything was fine, but I felt as if I had just escaped death. From that moment on, I began to understand that I needed to maintain a sleep schedule. But the sleep paralysis didn't go away right away. It kept coming back, especially during periods when I was very tired. Sometimes the visions seemed real, as if someone was talking right into my ear, and this eerie hissing echoed inside my head. Once I saw a silhouette that sat on my chest, and it seemed that it had no face, only a black void where eyes and a mouth should be. I was so scared that I almost passed out. Then I tried to figure out why this was happening. I read that it was because the brain was waking up, but the body wasn't. It seemed like a scientific explanation, but when you're dealing with these nightmares, it's hard to think rationally. I tried training myself. As soon as I woke up and felt paralyzed, I tried to focus on my toes. Sometimes it worked. When it didn't, I ended up in a real nightmare. One night, I heard someone calling me from the hallway, telling me that I needed to go out and see. I knew it wasn't real, but at that moment I had this wild desire to obey the voice, even though I couldn't move. It was as if my brain had split into two halves. One knew that it was all an illusion, and the other believed that there really was someone in the hallway. The hardest part is when you feel exhausted after such a night, you can't get a good night's sleep, and you have to go to work or school in the morning. I tried to see a therapist several times, who explained that in addition to improving my sleep patterns, relaxation practices and meditation would help me. Gradually, it became a little easier for me. Now I don't drink coffee in the evenings, and I make sure that I don't watch scary movies or read news that causes anxiety an hour before bed. I try to take care of my psyche, because sleep paralysis is a sign that the body is at its limit. Unfortunately, sometimes there are still relapses. For example, one time I came home very tired, fell asleep in my clothes and woke up in the middle of the night, again not feeling my body. This time I heard someone scratching at the wall near my bed, and gradually the steps became closer. Then I felt a touch on my leg, and it was so real that I started screaming at the top of my lungs, but these were only desperate attempts to make a sound. I don't know how I managed to get out of this state, but when I finally opened my eyes, of course, no one was in the room. I lit all the lamps, checked every door and window, almost called the neighbors. Then I sat in the kitchen for a long time, not daring to go back to bed. It helps me to think that this is a common phenomenon, that many people go through it and it does not indicate mental illness or a mystical entity. I understand that it is my tired brain playing a cruel joke on me. But when it happens again, I experience terrible fear every time, and nothing has been able to make these episodes less frightening. At least I have learned to live with it, although sometimes I break down. Hopefully, with time, I will be able to reduce the incidences of sleep paralysis to a minimum. User under the nickname Moonsnatch. Sleep paralysis has haunted me since my teenage years. I didn't understand what it was then. I thought I was falling victim to some kind of devilish attacks. The problem is that there were people in my family who believed in supernatural powers, often telling stories about brownies, ghosts. I grew up surrounded by mystical beliefs, and when I felt my first paralysis, my mother convinced me that this was an evil spirit coming to test our faith. I remember how I grabbed the blanket and repeated some prayer, trying to save myself. My first memory of this state is of me lying in a dark room, and in the corner a man's silhouette with long arms slowly emerges, and this man without a face is just a black shadow that leans towards me, as if he wants to reach my face. I tried to call for help, but my jaw felt like it was stuck together. Later, when I managed to break free from paralysis, I found myself sweating all over, and my heart was beating as if I had just run a kilometer. My mother then told me that I should light a candle and pray. I was afraid to go to bed after that. Over time, the attacks became more frequent. Sometimes I saw figures, sometimes I just felt a presence. But the most frightening incident happened when I was about 20 years old. I lived in a dorm room, and one night I heard someone trying to open the door from the inside. Yes, from the inside, that is, next to me, not in the hallway. I was paralyzed. I could not move. Then I saw how the door handle slowly turned on its own, and the door seemed to open. A dim red light emanated from the crack. I saw a dark silhouette that appeared in this door crack and seemed to be looking straight at me. I thought I was going crazy, because everything looked terribly realistic. Then the door disappeared, the paralysis left me, and at that very moment I jumped up on the bed, turning on the table lamp. My real door was locked. Everything was calm, but I couldn't stop shaking. I was shaking as if I was seeing something from a horror movie. When I started to educate myself, read scientific articles about sleep paralysis, it dawned on me that all these figures were a product of my tired mind. However, sometimes the paralysis was caused not by overwork, but by any stress and sometimes even hot weather. I realized that everyone has their own trigger. There were times when I tried to negotiate with my hallucinations. Once, during an attack, I heard someone saying my name. I decided to focus on the fact that it was just an illusion, and tried to mentally tell the voice that it was not there. As a result, I felt a strong vibration throughout my body and a sharp jolt, as if I was thrown out of this state. I shook myself and felt myself having difficulty catching my breath. After that, I often used a similar technique, trying to remember in paralysis that none of this was true, that my brain was creating images. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Then a young man came into my life, and for a long time I was embarrassed to tell him about the paralysis, because I was afraid that he would decide that I was crazy. But one night we were sleeping together, and I had an attack right in front of him. He realized that I was suffocating, pulled me by the shoulder, and I woke up. I burst into tears, told him that this happens to me, and he supported me. He said that if it happens again, he will immediately shake me. However, sleep paralysis often happens in the phase when the brain seems to wake up, but the body is not yet, so an outside touch often does not help because I cannot feel it at the right moment. But at least it became a little easier for me, because I knew that there was a person nearby who would understand. At the moment I live alone, we broke up, but I gradually learned to come to terms with sleep paralysis. It still manifests itself, sometimes accompanied by frightening visions. The last time I saw a long, narrow hand emerging from under the bed, which almost reached my blanket. The paralysis itself lasted about 10 seconds, but during this time I managed to get so scared that my heart did not calm down for a long time. Then I got up, poured myself some water, and repeated that it was just a trick of the brain. Gradually I returned to bed and fell asleep without another attack. But every time I think, what if next night it all happens again? I share these stories because I know how important it is to understand that we are not alone in this. It once helped me to realize that many people see an old woman, a devil, a shadow, or hear voices. I became less afraid, realizing that this is a phenomenon that does not pose a real threat, although it feels like the most terrible thing that can happen. If someone also suffers from this, I want to say that we can learn to cope with it and move on. Yes, it is still scary, but understanding the mechanics of the process reduces the fear a little. User under the nickname Lost Symphony. My episodes of sleep paralysis began during a period when I was going through depression. I couldn't sleep normally. I would fall asleep early in the morning and wake up around lunchtime. Life was a complete mess. One of those nights, I suddenly woke up and realized that I was in my room. But something was wrong. The lighting seemed wrong, too dim, and the walls seemed to have shifted. I tried to get up, but my body wouldn't obey. Suddenly, I saw a strange haze slowly floating out from the direction of my door, like a ghostly figure. I felt a chill coming from this figure and I felt uneasy. I wanted to call for help, but my throat was constricted and my lips would not move. It seemed like a long time had passed while this ghost glided around the room and I lay motionless. Then it came closer and began to stretch out something like hands towards me. I felt a sense of panic. I remembered all my childhood fears, all the moments when I felt alone and helpless. And then I heard a voice that sounded right in my head, telling me that I should give in, let it take me. I was sure that this meant death. Some inner impulse made me struggle. I concentrated on the little finger of my right hand and tried to move it. Seconds passed, and suddenly I managed to bend the finger a little. This tiny success gave me hope. I continued trying to move, and eventually I let go. I sat up with a jerk, breathing heavily. The room was in order, there was no ghost, but for a long time I felt the cold, as if I had touched something sinister in reality. After this incident, the paralysis began to manifest itself frequently. Each time it was accompanied by different visions. One time, I heard children's voices coming from the bathroom, as if little children were playing there. I tried to call them, but I couldn't, and then I heard evil laughter. Another time, I saw blood flowing from under my bedroom door and even smelled iron. When I was able to move and stand up, of course, there was no blood. I began to understand that something was clearly wrong with my mental state and decided to see a specialist. The psychiatrist said that sleep paralysis often occurs against the background of depression and anxiety disorders. He recommended drug therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. Gradually, as I began treatment, the episodes of paralysis became less frequent. But still, when they occurred, the same icy terror overtook me. I learned to keep a dream and paralysis diary, recording all the sensations so that I could track what the situation was like during the day, what I ate, and what time I went to bed. So I discovered that if I drank alcohol before bed, the likelihood of paralysis increased. The same was true for situations when I was very nervous or had not slept for more than a day. The scariest moment for me is when I start to doubt reality. When in paralysis I see something so clear that I can't believe it's a hallucination. It seems to me as if I've entered a parallel world. There was a time when, during such a state, I thought that perhaps I had already died, and all these images were posthumous visions. Then I tried to come to terms with the idea that it was all over. When I couldn't come to my senses for a long time from the horror. It seemed to me that my psyche could barely withstand it. Now, when I feel myself getting paralyzed, I try to immediately focus on a positive thought. I imagine a bright light or an image of a person I love. It doesn't always help, but sometimes I manage to return to normal faster. I think the key is learning to control panic. But that's easier said than done. Paralysis is still a part of my life, but I try to keep my fears in check so I don't get completely lost in the chaos. User under the nickname Grimnapper. I encountered sleep paralysis in the army. We had tough conditions. Constant training, lack of sleep, stress, early rises. We slept in the barracks on bunk beds. One night I woke up and realized that I couldn't move. It was dark around. I could hear my fellow soldiers breathing nearby, but it was as if I was being crushed from above. I was lying on my back and felt something pressing on my chest. I started listening and felt someone walking along the aisle between the beds. The steps were heavy and slow, as if an officer in boots was walking. I wanted to see who it was, but I couldn't turn my head. Then I saw that there really was a figure in uniform moving between the beds, but it had a dark void instead of a face, and it was taller than a normal person. I felt that this soldier was looking in my direction, although he had no eyes. Suddenly he turned sharply and walked towards me, and I thought that he would come right up to me and cause terrible horror. My heart was pounding. I tried to scream or at least cough to wake up the neighbor upstairs. At the very last moment, this figure began to melt into the darkness, and I felt a tingling sensation in my limbs. I was able to move my arms and then my body. I jumped up, exhaled loudly. The guys above and nearby did not notice anything. Everyone was asleep. No one heard my attempts to call for help. I sat like that until the morning. I could not fall asleep anymore, because I was afraid of the nightmare returning. In a military environment, few paid attention to psychological problems. When I tried to mention my paralysis, I was simply told that I was overtired and advised to go to bed on time if possible. Over time, the attacks recurred. Once I saw something like a giant spider crawling across the ceiling of the barracks, only with human arms. Each time, the paralysis accustomed me to the idea that I was doomed to complete defenselessness in such moments. When my service ended and I returned home, I hoped that the sleep paralysis would go away along with the stress of the army. But it didn't. Apparently, at some point, my brain memorized this pattern. Sometimes I sleep in my bed, oblivious for a couple of hours, and then suddenly fall into the same feeling of being paralyzed. Sometimes it's just a slight heaviness, without any scary visions, but more often I imagine something. The last time I had the feeling that someone was scratching at the outside of the mattress, as if my hands were on top of it and there were hands under the mattress trying to grab me through the fabric. When I woke up, I felt a sharp shudder. I've tried the advice I read online. Don't sleep on your back, try to stick to a schedule, don't overeat at night, don't drink energy drinks. But paralysis still happens. I've only realized that it becomes less frequent if I'm generally calm. If I'm in a period of anxiety, the nightmares return. My biggest defense is to try not to let myself drown in panic. But that's easier said than done. Of course, I understand that from a medical point of view, this is just a sleep phase disorder. But the personal sensations are so realistic and terrible that sometimes I believe that there is something more. Perhaps there is an otherworldly energy that manifests itself in these moments. I do not know, but I have become convinced in practice that our mind can be the greatest source of horror. No horror films can compare with the feeling of complete helplessness when you see something supernatural and cannot even close your eyes. User under the nickname Cloudy Husky. My first encounter with sleep paralysis happened after my 18th birthday party. I celebrated big time, came home in the early morning, went to bed and woke up around midday when it was already light in the room. I felt my eyes open, but my body was not moving. I was immediately overcome with fear because I had never felt anything like this before. As soon as I realized that I couldn't move, I suddenly felt uneasy. I tried to at least move my hand, but nothing worked. A moment later I noticed that the corner of the room seemed to darken, and some creature crawled out from there, similar to a dog, but with a terribly elongated muzzle and long paws. It looked at me with gloomy eyes. I wanted to scream, but only convulsively tried to inhale air. The creature reached out to me, brought its muzzle almost right up to my face, and I felt that it smelled of something rotten. Then it seemed to sense my horror and began to growl from its gut. I remember feeling a coldness inside me, and I was so shocked that I thought I was going crazy. But at some point my body jerked. I closed my eyes and opened them again. The creature was gone. I found that I could move and was breathing with difficulty, as if after a long run. Nothing in the room had changed, except that my heart was pounding and beads of cold sweat were running down my forehead. I told a friend who was interested in psychology about everything. She explained that it was most likely sleep paralysis, and that many people experience it. But I still began to fear at night that it would happen again. And it happened again a week later. This time I was lying on my side and suddenly felt that I couldn't move either. My gaze was fixed on the wall where the wardrobe stood, and I saw a shadow on the wardrobe. At first, I thought it was just the outline of clothes, but then the shadow moved and climbed off the wardrobe onto the floor. It seemed like a tangle of cobwebs and hair, slowly approaching me, dragging long whitish strands along the floor. I became scared. I couldn't close my eyes or jump up, and it seemed that this substance was about to touch me, stick together with me into something disgusting. Something fell in the hallway. Probably a draft moved a bucket with a rag, and at that moment I was able to twitch, as if this sound pulled me out of a nightmare. I sat up and began to breathe convulsively. Of course, there was no one, but the memory of this crawling lump remained so vivid that I could not relax for a long time afterwards. At night, I turned on a night light so as not to remain in complete darkness, but paralysis could happen during the day or in the light, it did not matter. Gradually, I realized that I had sleep paralysis not only because of lack of sleep, but also after intense emotional stress. If I have any conflicts in the family or personal problems, this paralysis trap comes at night, and I observe nightmarish visions. Once I dreamed that the walls of the room began to move, as if they began to breathe. I watched the wallpaper rise and fall, and suddenly in one place a face with bulging eyes appeared. I cannot put into words how creepy it was to look into those eyes, knowing that I could neither turn away nor close myself. Now I have learned to recognize the approach of paralysis by a special sensation in the body, something like vibration, tingling. When it starts, I try to relax as much as possible and repeat to myself that it will pass. Sometimes it helps. I let myself go further into sleep and do not wake up until the body is ready. But if I still wake up at this transitional moment, I often catch another terrifying nightmare. I try not to dramatize. I tell myself that this is an inevitable part of my perception, and I can live with it. But I admit that sometimes it still covers me. I am left with a feeling that I am immersed in a place where everything is twisted and filled with my hidden fears, which are embodied in monsters. User under the nickname Rare Vigil. My attitude towards sleep paralysis has changed over time. At first, like everyone else, I was scared, thinking that these were some kind of demons. Then I began to perceive it more as an inevitable feature of my sleep. Once I almost went crazy trying to understand why everything seemed so real if it was just a product of my imagination. The most powerful episode was when I heard my own voice saying, "He told me to give him my soul." Imagine I hear my own voice, but I do not control it, and it says wild things. It was extremely creepy because it felt like there was a second entity inside me. I tried to free myself, twitched my hands, but they did not move. And then I saw that next to me there seemed to be an invisible silhouette, the outlines of which were barely distinguishable, and this silhouette was turning towards me. At that moment I felt an icy wind, although the room was warm. It became clear to me that this was a hallucination, but understanding did not help. I heard my inner voice, which suddenly turned into hysterical laughter. I could not understand where this laughter was coming from, because I was not physically laughing. A few seconds later the paralysis receded. I sat up in bed, continuing to tremble with horror. I felt that I was not my own master. Over time I found a few tricks. One is to try to move my eyes to the side where I can see a familiar object, like a clock on the wall or a lamp, and try to fix my gaze on reality. I've also noticed that the calmer I am before bed, the less likely I am to see terrifying images. The ritual of relaxing in the evening and thinking about pleasant things seems to dampen the part of my brain that likes to generate fear. But it's not a panacea. I am often asked, what if during paralysis I see something pleasant, not scary? Several times I really did have not terrible, but rather strange and even curious visions. For example, I saw glowing butterflies flying around the room. I understood that I could not move, but these butterflies did not scare me. On the contrary, it was beautiful. I lay and watched them. Then, when I came out of paralysis, I even felt a slight disappointment that it was over. But such pleasant episodes are rare. More often the brain throws up sinister guests. What infuriates me most is helplessness. I am used to controlling the situation in life, but in paralysis I lose all ability to act. It drives me to panic attacks. I think the most effective way to ease the horror is to accept the fact that I have this feature. When I stopped perceiving paralysis as a tragedy, it became a little easier. Now I just try not to allow frequent attacks. I do not drink strong tea or coffee at night. Sometimes I do a little gymnastics. But if I still wake up in this state, I try to minimize the panic. I tell myself, this is sleep paralysis, it will end. Each time it is a kind of test, but I hold on. User under the nickname Irirook. Sleep paralysis gave me one of the scariest nights of my life. At the time, I was renting an apartment in an old building where the floors and doors creaked constantly. My imagination was already prone to dramatization, and now the surroundings contributed to it. One night, I woke up with the complete sensation that someone was breathing nearby. It seemed that a person was standing at the head of the bed and looking at me. I wanted to turn my head, but I couldn't. Gradually, a hand appeared in my field of vision, which seemed to hang in the air above my hair, as if it wanted to stroke or grab me. I felt that this hand was real. I even saw nails and thin skin. I was so scared that I began to hear blood pounding in my ears. I heard the floorboards creak, as if a person had taken a step further. This gave me a microscopic chance to calm down because he seemed to have moved away. But then I felt someone sit down next to me on the bed. The mattress sank slightly. It was so real that I no longer doubted that there was a stranger in my house. I tried to scream, but my mouth did not obey. I heard my own wheezing. Then I felt someone push me slightly in the side, as if they wanted to make sure I was asleep. When the paralysis subsided, I sat up abruptly and screamed, turned on the table lamp. The room, of course, was empty. The door was locked from the inside. I even went out into the hallway, checked if everything was intact. Silence, no one. My hands were shaking. I could not pull myself together. I was shaking with chills. I did not sleep until the morning, and the next day I was already looking for ways to somehow cope with this phenomenon. Then I first came across a description of sleep paralysis and realized that, apparently, I would have to get used to it. Then there was a series of nights when I experienced similar attacks. One of the most frightening cases was when it seemed to me that a woman with sunken eyes was hanging from the ceiling of my room. She had gray hair. She was swinging as if on a rope and was moaning barely audibly. I am ready to swear that I heard this moan with my own ears. I lay paralyzed and thought that now this corpse would fall on me. Then the paralysis passed, the vision disappeared, but for a long time I smelled a smell that seemed to me the smell of dampness or a grave. I understood that it was an illusion, but it seemed that my nose was lying to me, because I was smelling something disgusting. After such nights, I started having panic attacks during the day. I was afraid to fall asleep. This made my sleep even worse, and the paralysis became more frequent. It was a vicious circle. I went to a neurologist, and they told me that I had increased anxiety, that I needed to normalize my daily routine and take sedatives if necessary. I tried mild sedatives, started doing gymnastics before bed, and gradually the number of attacks decreased. But they still sometimes return, especially if I am very nervous. Now I live in a different place. The environment is better. The neighbors are calmer. I don't have to shake from every creak. But sleep paralysis does not depend on the place. It can cover me wherever I am. I have learned to understand that the real reason is hidden in my internal state. But if suddenly I catch an attack, the same horror covers me. It's just that later I come to my senses faster, reminding myself that all this is an obsession. If I could choose, I would never want to know what sleep paralysis is, but apparently there is no escape from it. User under the nickname Hollow Smile. I knew about sleep paralysis in theory because I had read about it. But when I experienced it myself, all my skepticism evaporated. The first time I thought I was in agony, that I was dying. It happened at the dacha. I lay down to rest during the day and suddenly woke up, unable to move. I heard crickets chirping outside, and for some reason it seemed to me that their sound was getting louder and louder, as if they were making their way into the house. Then, in the doorway to the veranda, I saw some white figure swaying as if in slow motion. Felt like it wanted to come in to me. I lay there and felt the cold creeping up my legs. I couldn't call my relatives who were on the property. I wanted to call them, but I couldn't make a sound. When I came out of the state, I ran to tell, but no one understood what I was talking about. They said that I must have had a bad dream, but I was sure that I had seen everything in reality. Since then, paralysis appeared in moments of extreme tension. The most terrible story happened in winter. I was lying down, about to fall asleep, when suddenly I felt as if I was being sucked inside myself, and I was falling into emptiness. At the same time, I realized that my body was paralyzed. Then I heard a voice saying that it was time for me to follow him. I understood that I did not want to go anywhere, but my body did not obey. At some point, I felt someone's hands taking me under the elbows, pulling me up. I saw only black space and a couple of luminous points in the distance, similar to stars. I thought that this was my death. The next thing I remember is waking up with a start and realizing I was in bed and the room was dark. I was drenched in sweat. My heart was pounding like crazy. I had never been so close to the idea that someone was trying to drag me away from this world. When I told them about it the next morning, they didn't give it much thought. It undermined my confidence in being able to trust anyone with this. People often think of sleep paralysis as a nightmare, but those who have experienced it know how terrifyingly real it is. Now I try to lead a healthier lifestyle to reduce the frequency of attacks. But if paralysis does strike, I try to repeat to myself that it will pass, that I will not die, that everything is just a figment of my imagination. Sometimes it helps to reduce the depth of horror, although scary scenes can still appear. Sometimes I imagine that this is a dark cinema zone of my mind, where a horror film is shown, and I am a spectator. True, I am a spectator against my will. But it is better than to think that some ghosts really want to take me away. User under the nickname Crimson Crow. My dreams have always been vivid, and I love analyzing dreams. But sleep paralysis is something else, a whole other level of fear. Sometimes it seems to me that I enter a zone where reality and sleep merge, and I become a hostage to this hybrid world. My first paralysis happened after a hard shift at work. I came home, collapsed on my bed, and didn't even have dinner. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling like I was being choked. It felt like someone's hand was squeezing my neck. Although I didn't feel pain, I felt a growing lack of air. I lay with my head thrown back and saw only a piece of the ceiling and a lamp. Then a silhouette slowly emerged from behind the lamp, as if the lamp had turned into a man's face. This face looked at me, opened its mouth, and dark liquid began to flow out, dripping right onto my chest. I thought that I was about to suffocate, either from the hands of this silhouette or from my own panic. When I was able to move, I jumped up, rubbing my neck. I didn't find any traces, but the sensation of being touched didn't go away for some time. Then I read that the sensation of suffocation and pressure on the chest is classic in sleep paralysis. But when it happens to you personally, no theory helps to get rid of the horror. Over time, these phenomena became more frequent. I began to be afraid to fall asleep. There were nights when I drank coffee to stay awake, but in the end I pushed myself even harder, and the paralysis would come anyway, only in an even more terrible form. One day, I woke up paralyzed and saw worms and insects crawling along the walls of my room. They were flocking to my bed, and I did not have the ability to even throw my hand back to shake them off. I felt disgust and panic. For the first time in my life, I realized that you can literally scream in your own mind, but not make a sound. When it all passed, I checked everything. Of course, no one was there. But the feeling that bugs were crawling on me remained for a long time. I almost tore off all my clothes, trying to get rid of the imaginary creatures. After that, I went to a neurologist who advised me, among other things, to take up sports to relieve stress. I started running, stopped staying up late, and the frequency of attacks decreased. But if I burn out at work or get into a lot of stress, there is a chance that these nightmares will return. One day, I took a night shift, got really nervous, came home, fell on the bed, and what I feared happened. I woke up paralyzed, feeling someone's gaze on me. Then I heard a voice say, "He said that he wanted to take my heart." I felt cold in my chest, as if something was drilling into my ribs from the inside. When I started moving my arms, the image dissolved, but after that I could not sleep until the morning. I sat in the kitchen by the light of the lamp. Now I know for sure, sleep paralysis is about our subconscious, stress, lack of sleep. But knowledge does not cancel out fear. I just learned to understand that, despite the realism of the sensations, they cannot cause me physical harm. They only have power over my psyche, but if I learn to let go of panic, they will lose their power. I try to lead a steady lifestyle as much as possible so that there are as few attacks as possible. However, I agree with the one who said that nothing compares to the horror of complete helplessness. Until you encounter it yourself, you will not understand how scary it is.